This is Power 987 Podcast. Now we're talking. Subscribe to Power 987 Podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. There's more on power987.co.za.
26 minutes to 2, Power Lunch on Power 98.7. Now we are talking. Now, on this edition of our property feature, we're going to be talking about subletting and lease transfers, right? A topic that's becoming increasingly common as more people look for flexible living arrangements. For some, subletting can be a smart way to cover rent or make use of unused space, especially during financial pressure or relocation. But on the other hand, it can also create serious legal issues if it's done without proper permission, potentially leading to eviction or breach of contract. So today, I want us to unpack both sides of this, the opportunities and the risks, and what both tenants and landlords need to know before entering into this sort of an arrangement. We'll be discussing what the law actually says about subletting, the difference between subletting and lease transfers, and landlord consent, tenant rights, and the legal consequences of getting it wrong. Alison Laxton, Associate Attorney at SBL Inc. Attorney is on the line with us. Good afternoon, Alison.
Hi, good afternoon, Kwena. Nice to be on the air with you again.
Great to speak to you as always. Thank you for always making time. We truly appreciate that. I think maybe let's start with the basics understanding, right? The difference or the legal difference between subletting and a lease transfer.
Yes. So these are two separate things. And remember that you have a subletting agreement, which is a tenant leasing from a tenant, right? That's subletting. And generally that is a contractual relationship that the landlord gives consent to the tenant to do. But the lease transfer is where you actually have a tenant transfer all of their rights to a completely different tenant. So, for example, you might be renting a place. Maybe your brother is coming to study at that university. You found a job in another province, and you ask the landlord to transfer the lease from yourself as the tenant to your brother because you no longer need to stay in that student accommodation, for example. All of the responsibilities and obligations in terms of that lease will shift to the new tenant. Whereas if you are subletting, there's three parties involved. It's your subletting tenant, your tenant who has the direct relationship, and the landlord as well.
So are tenants allowed to sublet the property freely, or does the law require landlord consent in each and every case?
So it's quite an important thing here to make sure as a landlord that you do not have what I call your ChatGPT leases.
We know those. We know
us lawyers are expensive, but we have some fantastic lease packs that we promote to our clients that are legally sound and that landlords can rely on. So your lease should always contain a clause about subletting, because if it is quiet on subletting, you may only be able to stop the subletting if you can prove that there's damages or a breach caused by it. So although it's not an automatic right per se, you have to consult the lease. It is really important for landlords to make sure that they get that written consent, and they ensure that they chat to their tenant and say, are you planning on subletting? Because remember, landlords need to vet tenants. So you're going to do credit checks. You're going to check that this person is employed. And if you are vetting someone who's not actually going to be the main tenant there, it's going to be subletting, then you have a very large risk that your property could become damaged, or if you're in a body corporate scheme, you could get fines, or they could be running an Airbnb unlawfully. So it is really important to note, landlord consent should be obtained, but your lease is the most important thing here. Make sure you have a clause, or at least come to an agreement with the tenant about will subletting be allowed or not.
So what are some of the biggest mistakes, Alison, if I may, that tenants make when they try to sublet that space?
So I don't want to call out our Capetonians here, but they're guilty of this one. And we see it all the time in Cape Town, where we've got a very international market, very lucrative for things like Airbnbs, and tenants do not inform their landlords, right? So they don't get that written consent, and then it can expose that tenant to a contract breach claim. So the landlord can say, you didn't get my permission, you are subletting unlawfully, I'm going to place you in breach and I'm going to cancel the lease with you and claim any damages. So that's a massive, massive issue, is not being transparent with your landlord and trying to make money quickly by listing the property on Airbnb, posing as the landlord, for example. Another thing that we see tenants make a huge mistake on is they don't get lease agreements with the tenants who are subletting. And this is a problem, because when you sublet a property, you still need to have a proper sublease agreement that sets out things like how long are they going to be there, what are their responsibilities, what is the rental payable. If you move someone in who is a bad subtenant, you will still have to try and evict them. And it can create massive liability for the tenant and the landlord as well. Now, another thing tenants also assume is once you sublet, they're not responsible in terms of the lease. They assume that the lease has moved over to the subtenant. That is simply incorrect. If you are subletting and the people you are subletting to do not pay the rental, the landlord is still going to be able to look at you as the main tenant for the rental that has to be paid. So all of these informal arrangements, verbal agreements, or casual short-term rentals are very risky, because you may not be able to enforce your rights and you might open yourself up to a lot of liability.
So who is legally responsible if a subtenant, right, for instance, stops paying rent or damages the property? And we know that happens a lot.
So the original tenant who signed the lease with the landlord is going to be the one who remains liable, and the landlord can still look to the tenant who has sublet for those rent and damages. So even if you think your tenant who's going to sublet from you seems like a good tenant, make sure that you vet them properly, because at the end of the day, your landlord's going to still hold you liable in terms of the main lease agreement that you signed with them. So unfortunately, if that person comes in, they damage the property, they cause any sort of, issues on the property, the landlord's going to look at the tenant and say, well, you were the one who got the subtenant in, and I'm going to look to you to recover those damages.
We're in conversation with Associate Attorney at SBL Inc., Alison Laxton. We are talking about subletting and lease transfers. If you've got questions, comments, clarity seeking for Alison, please feel free to join in 0861 987 000 tweets at PowerFM987 or directly at Kwena Moabelo voice note 083 303 7093. So let's talk how landlords then can protect themselves when a tenant requests to sublet or, again, to transfer a lease.
So I always say to my clients, prevention is better than cure. And I think in this case, it starts with having a very good lease agreement and having a very rigid vetting process, and also being upfront and transparent with whoever you're entering into that lease with. Obviously, your commercial properties, it's a lot easier to make sure that subletting is done correctly. It's your residential leases that can become quite problematic. So landlords should insist that tenants request consent to sublet in writing, and they should also provide the landlord with the proposed details and full details of that subtenant. So you should be conducting background checks, requesting references, and assessing risk. You don't want to move a bad tenant into your property, even if they're a subletting tenant, because if you have to evict them, you have to get a court order, and that's quite an expensive and long process. So if you are looking at subletting, speak to your attorney, speak to the team that you work with. If you work through a, let's say, managing agent or leasing agent, and ask them to draw up a formal addendum to your lease to set out how you will be dealing with subtenants. That's really important here, is to get everything in writing. Do not work on people's good word anymore. Gentlemen's agreements used to be, all fair and honored, and that's just not the case, unfortunately, in today's time.
So with the rise of short-term rentals, Alison, how is the law responding to tenants who use platforms to sublet without permission?
So this is really interesting. SBL has recently published a little bit of insight into the new proposed amendments to the Tourism Act, actually. So those who are listing Airbnbs, right, and looking to gain some short-term rental income, in terms of the Tourism Act that's going to be amended, there's a new code, and they're going to look at, are you actually paying tax on that income? Are you declaring that income? Are you following the municipal bylaws, for example? So it's going to become quite a thing. You're going to have to comply with bylaws, zoning regulations. You're going to have to get approval from your HOA or your body corporate. So it's actually going to become a lot more complicated than it has been if you are running an informal Airbnb, especially in places like Cape Town and Johannesburg, because they have introduced bylaws now that require zoning compliance and registration for short-term letting. So that's something to just be aware of, is that they are cracking down on it. Cape Town, we've seen the most cracking down on these Airbnbs, but it's not going to be this supplementary, tax-free, nice income that people can get anymore. It's going to be something where you have a lot of laws to comply with. So if you are in the Airbnb space, if you are subletting, aside from getting your landlord's consent, you should also be speaking to a property attorney who can guide you on any compliance requirements within your municipality specifically.
And I guess we can never stress this enough, Alison, that sometimes because we want to cut costs, because lawyers and attorneys are very expensive, we want to do things on our own, but you need to know exactly the paperwork. Make sure that you've got the right contract, because sometimes if we do it ourselves, that's where we end up opening ourselves to the abuse, as it were, of the contract.
Yes. We recently had a matter come to us. A client in Cape Town opened an Airbnb guest house without the right permission, and the municipality cracked down on them. And unfortunately, they didn't do it the right way, and it's cost them millions of rands to comply. So unfortunately, it's one of those things where it seems like a lot of money up front maybe now to consult with someone, but I can promise you it's not going to be as much as if you have to comply after the fact, and any fines that might follow from the municipality. So if you are in a municipality that's quite strict, and Cape Town is one of them, the City of Cape Town is cracking down on these unlicensed Airbnbs, please make sure you get a good property lawyer to consult with you, and just make sure that you are compliant with all those municipal bylaws and zoning laws.
We're in conversation with Alison Laxton, as Associate Attorney at SBL Inc. We'll take your calls and your voice notes or messages on X if you do have. We are talking subletting and lease transfers.
Never miss a conversation. Download the podcast on power987.co.za and listen at your convenient time.
Just about 10 minutes, make that 12 minutes to 2. Power Lunch on Power 98.7. Now we are talking. Associate Attorney at SBL Inc., Alison Laxton, on the line with us. Alison, as we start winding down the conversation, I want us to talk about the practical advices, right, that you would give to both tenants and landlords. And maybe let's start with tenants, right, to avoid disputes and stay on the right side of the law.
So I think what's important for tenants is, just like we get bad tenants, we get bad landlords, right? So don't ignore those red flags. A landlord who is going to be transparent will give you a proper lease agreement. They'll take you through what is allowed and isn't allowed. Be upfront with them if you intend or need to sublet at any point, and just ask them about that. So the golden rule is really just transparency between the parties. Before you want to do something, raise that in a conversation before you put your pen on the paper and say, how does it work? How do I obtain your written consent before I sublet or if I have to transfer this lease? And how do we enter that into a formal lease, sublease agreement to regulate this arrangement between the subtenant, myself, and you as the landlord? And a transparent, honest, good landlord is more than happy to have those paper trails put in place. He's more than happy to sign agreements. A landlord who's going to give you issues is someone who does not want to put pen on paper and doesn't want to record things in writing. So that's just something I would recommend to tenants, is make sure that you're upfront about it and get everything into a valid lawful lease agreement. So remember, as a tenant who wants to sublet, you still remain liable to the landlord unless there is a full lease transfer. So it's in your interest as well to make sure that you don't work off these verbal agreements. And for landlords, the best protection is really to have a good lease agreement with clear clauses about subletting and transfers, how you're going to vet these subtenants carefully, and how you document any approvals or refusals, rather, of subtenants. So how do you make sure that everyone coming onto your property is there lawfully and actually will be able to afford the rental that you are asking each month?
And then for landlords?
I would say for them, just make sure you've got that transparency from the tenant. Be upfront with them. When you are vetting your tenants, vet them well. Remember, it's a bit of a red flag if you have tenants who have a very long, complicated story when they come to you. Oh, but my brother will pay the lease, and it's my auntie who's coming up from the Eastern Cape, and they'll tell you all of these things. That can be a bit of a red flag. So if you're picking up that they may need to sublet, you still need to make sure you have those valid agreements in place, because when things go wrong, that's when you need to rely on the lease agreement to get things back on track.
And I guess more than anything, right, tenants should know that for subletting, it can't be done without the landlord's permission, So as long as those contracts and agreements are well documented in a legal document, it makes it easy for everyone who wants to at least try that or attempt something to that effect.
Absolutely. And even as a subletting tenant, we've had some subletting tenants come to us and say, well, we had no idea that we've been asked to leave the property. We're being evicted. What's going on? And the tenant who was subletting to them wasn't paying the landlord. And these are all things that can come up. So make sure when you're dealing with anyone, even as a subletting tenant, that you get those things in writing, that you ask the right questions, that you even speak to the landlord yourself and say, is it okay that we're going to sublet? Have you got approval from your tenant? Just to make sure that that transparency is there.
Then your final advice, Alison, what would be your final advice, especially for somebody who is not too sure how to handle this, especially landlords? Because I think tenants, they should know that you can't do that without the permission of a landlord.
Yes. So I think the first thing I would say is, if you are new to rental property as an income and you're a landlord and you're looking to grow your portfolio, make sure that you have some property professionals, whether it's an attorney or a really seasoned agency or agent, in your corner who can guide you. Don't navigate this alone, and please don't rely on AI agreements and what Google tells you, because unfortunately it's not going to give you the whole picture and you might end up with legal issues. So that's what I would say, is make sure you get some advice, approach those experts. We have various support systems for our clients and for agents where we help them with their questions, and we want to make sure that they do things from the get-go, and make sure that you have a solid lease agreement in place and that you have a solid tenant vetting process in place as well. I think that's the most important thing. Remember, in South Africa, residential tenants have a lot of rights. You cannot be evicted lawfully without a court order, and that can be a very expensive exercise. So sometimes I say to clients, it's better to have an empty property for 6 months and then find someone good than to have bad tenants in that property for 6 months and they are running up arrears and using utilities and not paying for them. So I would say, look, just make sure that you do things the right way and seek advice if you don't know what you are doing in the South African rental sphere.
Alison Laxton, just before I let you go, for somebody maybe who wants to get information, be in touch with SBL Inc., where and how do we get in touch with you?
Right, so you can Google us. It is SBL Inc., and we are based all over the country. We have a few different offices, but you can also give us a call at 086-100-7757, or they can pop us an email at inquiries@sbllaw.co.za, and that's inquiries with an E.
Fantastic. Alison Laxton, as always, thank you so much for always making time to speak to us. I appreciate your time and your insight.
You've been listening to Power 987 Podcast. For more podcasts, visit power987.co.za or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.